which again will create more independence. It gives women the ability to potentially live in a house on their own, which again will have implications for energy demand. So let me talk a little bit then, with that context, a little bit about the challenges that Riyadh faces today. The first kind of thing to kind of keep in mind is the population is growing, as I kind of alluded to, this 100,000 to 7 million in a relatively short period of time. It's growing really rapidly. Family size is quite large. And as a result, annual energy consumption is about twice the growth rate of GDP. Urbanization is expected to continue and increase up to 97% roughly in 2030. And the implication of that is the city of Riyadh should be around 8.5 million people in 2030. And they're adding about 22 people a day. And energy subsidies, this is something the country is aggressively trying to deal with, but it's still a big issue. Around $13 billion a year are spent subsidizing energy in one form or another, and that's about 9% of government expenditures on an annual basis. There's studies out there, so this is a little bit dramatic. I don't think this would actually happen. The Saudis wouldn't let it happen. But if this trajectory continues and they do nothing about this increase in oil demand and don't change over the source of electricity in the country, it could be a net oil importer by 2040. So it's something that has to be addressed. It has to be addressed really soon. From an urban planning perspective, this has a couple of implications for a couple of challenges. The first is it's a really sprawling city. So the picture you show here, and I'll show another one a little bit later, this is about the one area in town, one of two areas in town where there are tall buildings. Everything else are essentially villas or residences. And the city is growing and growing, but just more of the same, at least in the current trajectory. Again, I talked a little bit earlier about a high per capita energy consumption. This continues to be an issue. Since everyone lives in houses, there's no public transportation. There's actually quite bad traffic, at least a few times a day. And I would say, Riyadh has a few things going for it, but one of them is it's not a very walkable city, and it's not in terms of its quality of livability, it's not very high as well. And then I guess finally, which is an issue for this third of the population of Riyadh who are poor, there's a real lack of affordable housing. So all of these things are things that Riyadh is going to have to kind of address as it goes forward. So let me start to talk a little bit about the kind of growth path that it's on as a city. And so this graph is really just plugging I guess the modal share of motorized private mode, which I guess is just, for me, is just a fancy way of saying how many people are driving private cars, and then the GDP per capita on the horizontal axis. And what it's really, and this is a little bit old, it's 2006, but I think it's probably the picture today would be relatively similar in my mind. And there's really three basic kind of patterns that urban studies folks talk about, at least on this kind of picture. There's kind of a North American pattern, which is as you get wealthier, you tend to want more and more cars. There's a European pattern, which is, as you get wealthier, maybe a little bit more cars, but then, that doesn't go up to the same rate as a North American kind of city. And then there's efficient patterns, which utilize fewer and fewer private vehicles for individuals. And you can see, up at the top here, Riyadh is a real outlier in this respect. Everyone has a car, there's no public transportation, and it really doesn't fit onto one of these traditional patterns or at least right now it doesn't seem to fit. We're hoping as things change, as things develop, we could bring it down to a more reasonable kind of balance on this kind of graph. So in terms of thinking about energy efficiency and transportation, this kind of stylized picture is really taking the idea of, highly energy efficient or no energy consumption to different modes of transport to kind of very much modes of transport that are much more likely to consume energy. So of course the kind of least or the most energy efficient form of transport is not using fossil fuels or energy at all, just using your legs, or there's no travel takes place at all, you just stay at home. I guess the second point might be you walk around your cycle, so you're not using anything from the electricity grid. As you start to get a little bit more energy intensive, you have public motorized transport. And then at the kind of maximum, you have individual motorized transport, like a car or a motorcycle or a taxi. And so as you move up on this graph, it becomes more and more important to focus on how do you minimize the carbon footprint of that vehicle choice. And the main thing I think to take away from this figure would be that the decision to travel or not travel and the energy consequences of that decision will be affected by the mode of travel that you're going to select. So that has implications for fuel consumption and therefore carbon emissions. So the number of vehicles, the amount of congestion you have on the streets, the driver behavior, the vehicle condition, the fuel type, all of these things start to come into play as you move up on this, up into the right on this kind of stylized figure. So I'm starting to get towards moving from the problem to the solution, but before, kind of along that path, or along the way to that, this figure plots the per capita passenger transport energy use. So how much does your vehicle choice use in terms of energy against urban density? And so in the next couple of slides, I'll pick on Atlanta, Georgia, because it's kind of a nice example, which has some similarities to Riyadh, at least in this context. So Atlanta, in this case, is not particularly dense and has a lot of people driving cars. Very little public transportation. And as you move along this curve, what you're getting is a more and more dense city, or more and more dense cities, but less and less private individual cars for people. So at the far extreme, you'd have a very dense set of cities that don't really rely on individual passenger vehicles. But as a result, the energy use per GDP starts to change quite rapidly. So the city of Atlanta, for example, it has a very similar GDP to Singapore down here. But its use of private transport is about 5 times that of Singapore. So, and I don't think, Riyadh's not on here, but the point here, I think, is that densification of a city turns out to be really important for energy use, and that's where we want to hope to drive Riyadh going forward. To show this in a slightly different way, and this is a little bit of an old graph, 1990, but it still illustrates the point, I think, quite well. To pick on Atlanta again, it's got about the same number of people as Barcelona does, 2.8 million in 1990 for Barcelona, about 2.5 for Atlanta. But the size of the city in terms of geography is quite large. So it's around 4,300 square kilometers. Barcelona is about 160 square kilometers. And I think quite intuitively, you could have a very efficient public transportation system for a city of the denseness that Barcelona has. But, and in fact, it has a nice subway line, 99 kilometers of line with 136 stations, and 60% of the population is within a 600-meter walk to the subway line. Okay, but you go to a city like Atlanta, and if you've driven through Atlanta, you would probably recognize this really quickly. If it were to build a metro line to have the same level of access, you'd need around 3,400 kilometers of metro line with 2,800 new stations. So not a particularly effective choice for Atlanta to, at least in this kind of sprawled urban environment, to get to the same kind of situation as Barcelona. And the takeaway from this, I guess, is density turns out to be really important, which, if you haven't figured out yet, is again one of the big challenges for Riyadh. And just to make it drive the point a little bit home, what does the residential density look like in Riyadh? I'm just picking one small district here, but this is really quite typical of residential districts in Riyadh. The Al Masif district, the total area is about 420 hectares, 8,300 dwellings, 2,400 villas, and so its residential density is about 5.67 dwellings per hectare. And so, even with the typo here, according to most guidelines, in order to have a really efficient use of a metro line, you need about 40 to 75 dwelling units per hectare. So 5.7 to 40 to 75, it's really kind of off, but there is a metro line, which really will be the next slide. Actually, not quite yet. Just one more point on why sprawl versus density is not a good thing. Just to talk about the fiscal cost of sprawl, in terms of, just to use the US as an example to illustrate the point, so just to compare the annual cost of services, so police, fire, roadways, and sewer. In a very urban, dense environment in the US, it's about, for a new household, it's about $89. In a very sprawled location like Atlanta, it's about $1,200 per new household. So it turns out to be quite expensive to provide services for a very sprawled, urbanized city. Riyadh, and this is another picture, so you can see this is really the major street that has tall buildings, and then in the background you'll see another little neighborhood that hasn't opened yet, but maybe in the next couple of years will be something that people can use. But everything else looks like this in terms of houses, and as a result, it's the fastest de-densifying city in the world, and the rate of sprawl exceeds the rate of economic growth. So it's got a problem. So not to be nasty, but without really thinking about this problem, the idea of the Riyadh Metro kind of came around in 2012, 2013, when the price of oil was a little bit higher. And construction began on the metro in April 2014. And so it's a 176 kilometer line, or metro, with 6 lines and 85 stations. This is the major station, Zahadid building in the middle of Riyadh. Importantly, because it's quite hot in the summer, you don't want to walk a kilometer after you get off the metro. There's a bus network that's with 300 stops, that's another 1,900 kilometers. It's the first, there really is no public transportation in Riyadh right now. Okay, there are little buses, but no one uses them except in very particular circumstances. So this is really going to be the first public transportation that exists. Inshallah, the end of this year, the second half of this year, the first half of the metro will open, and by the end of the year, the whole thing will open. Okay, so what does this do? It gives Saudi Arabia, or it gives Riyadh in particular, an opportunity. Okay, so they have this metro, they have this sprawling city. What can they do to solve the energy problem, or how can they use this to their advantage to solve the energy problem? Well, so the Saudis' NDC under the Paris Agreement, it really talks, it's the two major kind of focuses, or two of the major focuses it talks about or deals with are introducing energy efficiency measures in buildings and transportation, and the development of metros. So you have a metro in Riyadh. The other two urban centers in Saudi Arabia are Jeddah and Dammam, and you have metros being developed in those cities as well. Also, I think in Mecca, those would be a metro, but that's more for travelers. And so the opportunity is to take this more transit-oriented development, and we'll talk about this again on the next slide, with the Riyadh Metro, and try to solve some of these problems that I've talked about so far. And just to talk a little bit more about other measures that are going on. I mean, so in terms of buildings, I mean there are more and more standards which are focused on having more energy efficient buildings. So the kind of typical Riyadh construction of these houses that I showed you just a second ago tends to be cinder blocks covered by a little bit of paint, which doesn't have great insulation, doesn't have great energy efficiency. So they're trying to change that. KAPSARC, the building where I worked, is one example, maybe a bit of a conspicuous example, but a LEED Platinum certified building, nice ventilation, taking advantage of kind of a lot of different design ideas to have a much more energy efficient building. Some of the energy efficient measures with transportation include, raising the price of gasoline, introducing emission standards for vehicles, having restrictions on the imported vehicles so that you get more energy efficient cars. But you're only going to get if you have this sprawling urban environment without a densification plan, you're only going to get so far with these kinds of measures. And so the metro and this idea of transit-oriented development, or TOD, I think is going to be a major factor for Saudi Arabia, or for Riyadh in particular, going forward. So let me talk just briefly about transit-oriented development, or TOD. And this is I mentioned kind of a paradigmatic view on how to develop Riyadh from here on out. This would be kind of the framework for smarter cities. So I guess this is close to smart as I get. Smarter, really not necessarily to a fully smart city. So what is a transit-oriented development? Well, it involves this idea of created really concentrated nodes of moderate to high density developments that support a very balanced mix of land use around transit stations. So you take the metro and take advantage of the construction of the great kind of ability to build things in Saudi Arabia. And you rethink how the city looks and rethink how people live and work and play in this TOD model. And so the guiding principles involve, things like, trying to be able to easily switch between modes. You can take a bus to the metro. You can take the metro to close to where you work, and then take, maybe a bike or a scooter or something smaller at the very end. So you're easily switching transportation modes to have a very efficient path from start to finish. You have things like complete streets, and the idea here is that you can live, work, play, learn, shop, whatever you want to do, all in the same location. So you go back to that, if you think about that energy efficiency model of transportation I talked about a few minutes ago, you stay in the same place, you don't have to go anywhere to do whatever it is you want to do. You have, as a result, you have very mixed land uses, you have street-oriented buildings. I think you get the idea. So basically, you have a nice, and actually, the King Abdullah Financial District is an example of this. The first example, and this is where the main metro station is, of a very densified mixed-use environment where there's shopping, there's residential, there's work, and we'll see if people actually fill the towers, it'll actually be a real success. And the idea, ultimately with TOD, is you don't have the need for a car anymore. So, maybe Saudi Arabia won't move from that outlier position on one of the very first graphs I showed to somewhere in the far lower right, but hopefully it's getting better. And so let me just talk then about the kind of side effects of this kind of TOD vision as an enabler for energy efficiency. So once you have density achieved, you can do a lot of really good things in terms of improving energy efficiency. You can do things like district cooling, water recycling, waste to energy, urban agriculture. And just to focus on district cooling, which is, I think, of particular value to a place as hot as Riyadh is the kind of energy savings you could get from district cooling. 70% of electricity in the GCC goes to air conditioning. It's, at least for someone like me, it's an essential. You can't live without it. And the energy savings from district cooling will be around 50%, and the plants are going to last for 30 years. So the point here is that once you get the densification philosophy implemented, there's many more things you can do to reduce reliance on energy. And so then this is the last slide, and this is the teaser on the work that we're doing and the model that we're developing. So we're working with what's called the Riyadh Urban Lab, which is a consortium of scientists and urban planners, and the Riyadh Development Authority, which is essentially a committee that works for the mayor of Riyadh. And we're building this what I would call a spatial urban energy model for the city of Riyadh. So the kind of first version will be just a GIS model, and then we'll move into a computational model with some agents responding and starting to optimize. But the first version will just be doing things like testing if you have different kinds of densification proposals or ideas around metro stations that are compatible with this TOD philosophy, what are the implications of that for energy use? And then, as a result, you can start to assess the impact on energy consumption, buildings, and the transportation sector. And so the hope is, as the city is re-envisioned and as new development starts to happen, as you kind of change the neighborhoods and the composition of Riyadh, you can look at different kinds of state-of-the-art technologies that build these high-intensity neighborhoods, and you can start to demonstrate what kinds of gains could be realized with different kinds of interventions. And so I think I've got a couple minutes left, but I'll just leave it there and put the rest to questions. Great.
Microphone for a second. Please take a chair.
Left of here.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. Efird, sorry, I do apologise.
No problem.
I went with Efird.
No one gets it right, that's okay.
So now we move into the Q&A session. Does anybody actually have a question they want to begin with? You're going to push me to... Okay, we have one.
Yeah, I'm Benjamin from Technical University of Freiburg, Germany. My question goes to Dennice. First of all, I really enjoyed your presentation. My question is, did you consider non-availability time, in your model, because you have an enhanced maintenance time for offshore wind parks?
So we didn't look at reliability. We really looked at participation in these markets, with the idea that in a lot of these markets you can say when you're available to participate and when you're not. Now, we've been looking at whether or not it increases maintenance costs for these farms to participate in them, but we're assuming that if you're doing maintenance, you wouldn't be able to participate in these markets, but you also wouldn't be able to sell bulk energy at that time either. So.
Okay, thank you. Another question. I think maybe I'll pass the mic up. You can shout. Yeah, okay.
Ian McGill from the University of New South Wales. Thank you, Dave. I think you've got a new job there, mate. Okay. Sorry, Ian McGill from the University of New South Wales. Some questions for Duncan. I was interested in your use of the term grid parity, and I've never liked that term, but what I was trying to understand for your study looking over Africa, where you compared decentralised versus grid, and you did a grid parity exercise, does that mean you just used the tariffs in those countries? Because in many of those countries, those tariffs don't actually represent the true cost of supply, do they?
You're exactly right, yeah. And we just used the tariff because, well, so I hinted at this actually as a sort of, I think, an important area for future work. So I said a couple of things. One, I think to do it right, you need a proper model of grid extension costs, and you need a strategy to incorporate decentralization into the grid extension model. And I do have a student that's done some of that work and has built a model that enables some level of decentralization in a centralized grid expansion framework. And it is striking how differently you would build a network if you have access, or if you sort of embrace, let's say, sort of distributed or decentralized solar plus storage. But I can't give you sort of the full story yet, but it's certainly, I think it's a really, I guess I'm giving you a long-winded answer to, I think you're exactly right. But just as a first pass, at least just to see, are we in the ballpark, we chose to work with the tariffs. But some of the utilities do have full cost recovery, but others are certainly subsidized by public funds.
And even those that do have full cost recovery, it's an enormous amount of smearing that loses the issues around rural supply. We looked at this in Kenya, and the World Bank program, $1,000 per household for grid extension to poor households with low consumption. And yeah, we used grid parity as well. If I'm allowed to, it's also on this grid parity question. If I've understood it correctly, when you showed that US study with load defection and grid defection, you had what you called private marginal cost. Is there a network component to that, or did you stick all of network into the fixed costs? Because I think this is a very important issue for tariff design.
Right. So, okay. Yeah, I was expecting that somebody would want to talk a little bit more about this. So, all we did was take essentially the real-time electricity price, an hourly measure, and use that to represent the local energy serving company's private marginal cost. So you could argue that there's externalities that you might want to include in that. That might be what you're getting at. It sounded like you were asking more specifically about network as well.
In Australia, we have discussion of peak demand defection, right? Where you use your battery just to knock down your peak demand charges. Right. So that's marginal in the extent that you can do something about it. And it reduces grid defection because you can still impact on these, otherwise what might be termed fixed costs?
Yeah, right.
Maybe I can suggest we take that as more of a comment or a question to think about, just in the interest of diversity, making sure that we cover everybody's questions. And sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Are there more questions from the floor? In which case, I'll pose one towards Brian, if I may. I think it's interesting, the discussion and the challenges you raised that Riyadh are facing. I am intrigued by whether or not you've had discussions, beginning to think about the possible role of sequencing. Because it seems like you've got two issues to address at the same time: the physical infrastructure through urban sprawl and the behavioral processes which are going on, which connect to how people use the physical infrastructure. Which comes first?
Well, actually, the answer is easy, because the Riyadh's already decided. They built the metro, and now they have to figure out how to optimize the city around it.
Right, but the metro doesn't eliminate the sprawl, let's say.
No, it doesn't.
There's deeper issues that the metro can touch upon, but not fully resolve.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a long, I'll just give the short version, I guess, is, I mean, I think the fundamental challenge, I believe, will be similar to kind of other challenges the country faces, which is, I mean, if you just, my own experience with Saudis is their preference is to, they live with their family, and when they get married, they want their own house to live with their new family, and that's their preference. And you see, there's no option, and this is because there's been no demand for tall residences, or, for a skyscraper that's filled with apartments or condos. And so, yeah, I mean, you're going to have to overcome that kind of social, cultural proclivity for, I want my own house, and I want my children to have their own houses. And yeah, how do you make that behavioral change? That's a big challenge. I don't know, but they'll have to do it.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question, please. Our newer helper. I sincerely appreciate the
question
support.
goes to Brian, and again, you mentioned about this TOD strategy that has been also used for improving the energy efficiency. But what is the role for the renewable energy here, and why it has not been considered, like solar and, for example, rooftop solar, and that component is missing. And the second thing is, for example, if Riyadh is going to be a smart city, and what could be the role for the ICT's based technologies?
So I don't know on the second. That's an easy one. I'll just tell you. That's way outside my area of expertise, so I can't address it. On the first one, now I've forgotten the first question. I'm sorry.
Renewable energy.
Yeah, renewable energy. Yeah, it's an obvious one. I didn't talk about it at all, but there actually is a big initiative in Saudi Arabia for utility scale solar. I think the initial $200 billion that we're going to spend on it has been reduced quite dramatically. And they're not looking for 200 gigawatts from solar anymore. But I know the tenders are going out now, and kind of following what's happening in the Emirates. Certainly the Saudis are going to try to emulate some of that. And there's also a lot of rooftop solar. There's a nice study that just came out of KAPSARC, if I may say so, and I didn't write it, on rooftop solar for mosques. And at least at that scale, with the size of the building, some other characteristics of the mosque, it turns out to be quite useful to have rooftop solar. And then you see, I mean, just small little things. Street lights are now, every new street light has a solar panel on the top of it. I don't think there's much, you have to go really far north, I think, to get any wind in Saudi Arabia. So and hydro is not really an issue either. So it's just basically solar. But there's a little bit of talk about nuclear that kind of comes and goes every couple of years. It's come again. We'll see if they actually build a plant. But yeah, definitely. I mean, the main thing that the Saudis have to do is to stop burning oil for power and get those barrels exported. And gas is the first answer, but then renewables, I think, are coming on too. So it's definitely a big part of their plans.
Thank you. We have a question over here. Yeah. You can pass up through the ranks.
I'm coming around. No problem. Steve Platter, University of Auckland. I've got a question for Dennice. I just want to get a feel for how important these wake effect is. So if you have an N by N wind farm, what's the reduction in output compared to N by N times the output of one turbine?
So that's not a really simple answer, but I can tell you that typically, typically if you have a wind farm that's about 7 diameters between the rows, the second row produces 40% less power than the first row. But if you have a long enough wind farm, at the end, all the rows produce the same amount of power. So you get a precipitous drop-off, a little bit more drop-off, and then it sort of levels out. Now, some of the wind farms that were built early on, it's much worse than that because they're not far enough, the turbines aren't far enough apart for the wind to regenerate. Now, my colleague Charles, who does the simulations, did a study that showed that if you put the turbines 15 diameters apart, which for various reasons is not economic, right, because you need so much land, then it's just, you just multiply the output because they're far enough apart that the wake effects don't matter. But the density of the farm is really critical in answering that question.
I like this idea of talking about advanced wake modeling in a graveyard session just after lunch. A couple of questions whilst you have the mic, small questions. We have, if I understand correctly, you model the wake as a two-dimensional process, essentially. Could it go a third dimension? Could you have multi-layered? I mean, if we're talking about more sophisticated understanding of the wind flows, would that add anything?
It depends on what you're asking about. So basically what you care about is at hub height, and we sort of model it as a cone. So in some sense, the cone is three-dimensional. Now, if you want to get really into a really interesting physics discussion, which I won't have too much here, when you actually yaw the turbines, you get far more three-dimensional effects because now your wake starts to curl around. And we can talk about that offline, but it's fascinating what the wake does. And there's all the, the vortical structures that arise really affect things like maintenance of the turbines and also affect the power output that you have. We have lots of cool vortex models we're just developing.
Just trying to bring it to the topic of cities, though, the same issue of wind turbines. Are there ways in which cities could be used to facilitate artificial wind corridors that might help generate more sustainable wind flows that wind farms in close proximity to those centres might be able to take advantage of?
So this is a complicated question. And one of the things that's really complicated about it is that cities also heat up things. And so the atmospheric stability will change if you have a city that's heating up. And that actually changes how much kinetic energy there is in the wind. And so if you have conditions where you get more kinetic energy from the change in stability, because you have unstable and stable and one is better than the other, you can actually get more power output. But you get less power output, so it's typically, on a diurnal cycle when you have stable or unstable conditions. But this is a really big issue offshore, where you definitely have changes in stability conditions. We did everything with neutral stability.
Sure. Any more questions from the audience? Peter, please.
Just very briefly, I have another question for Duncan, which is what kind of assumptions did you make about the batteries that go with this, in particular, how the capacity changes over time and how long they last and so on?
Yeah, right. So we assumed no degradation of capacity, but a 10-year replacement cycle. So we used a 10-year replacement. So we use a 20-year investment horizon, but assume the batteries are replaced at 10 years and also a 90% round trip efficiency on the batteries. But we didn't look at degradation. Yeah.
Okay, I'll take liberty of just one more closing question. I have one for you, Brian. What are your views on whether or not we should be considering regulating grid defection? I can imagine arguments where it might be counterproductive to long-run welfare.
Yeah, so some folks use the term inefficient grid defection as the kind of phenomenon that we were looking at, where if you've got this fixed charge, you're defecting from the grid because of that signal, but it's from a social welfare perspective inefficient for you to be doing so. And so I think there are a few things you could do. One would be to charge an exit fee, which basically represents the levelized cost of all of the expenditures that your utility has made on your behalf. An alternative would be to simply just use general fund revenues to pay for network costs. So don't recover network costs in electricity tariffs. Say, okay, electricity networks are public good. We'll pay for them with public funds, and then all marginal costs get paid for out of some sort of a tariff. I think there could be other solutions as well. We have yet to see, I think, if it's ultimately going to become a problem, but I think it's genuinely possible.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well, in which case, we're pretty much on time. Would you like to ask a question? You've held the mic for such a long time.
He already answered my question with his last answer.
I have one more for Brian. What might happen if you have, you do all this with the Riyadh, and then we have autonomous electric vehicles lowering the cost of ride sharing?
I mean, in principle, it sounds good. And I'm a little out of my depth, but my understanding, one of the challenges for EVs in Riyadh and in that region in general is the heat. I mean, it creates the air conditioning issue, but also I think the efficiency of the battery is not very good in the heat. So, I mean, there's a challenge to overcome there. But yeah, I think, you know, even things like Uber or the Cream, I mean, any sort of smartening of the way cars are used is going to help. So autonomous EVs would help if you get the electricity production in a greener place as well.
Except there might be problem with defection.
Oh.
I'm going to make a comment on that, which is the autonomous public transport becomes really good for feeding public transport. So you use it to connect and book your car to get you to the train. But I want to follow up on the last question about the network and grid defection, because I'm actually quite interested in this concept that says the way to recover the fixed cost a large part of the fixed cost of networks is, in fact, in an Australian context, put it into the land rates and make it part of that taxation recovery. It sort of goes back to hotelling and the marginal cost controversy. But it seems to me to be a logical way of dealing with the grid cost as the grid nature changes. I haven't heard anyone until you today actually re-raise that. So have you seen a discussion of that happening recently, or?
Among colleagues, yes.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's yet time to sort of raise it up to the level of a more public discourse. I think I think that as soon as you start using the T word, at least in the US, it becomes problematic. And so even if we're saying there's a cost neutral shift, I think moving it out of what the electricity companies currently charge people on their bills to general fund, especially, you know, I think that any sort of the optics of government support for utilities in the U.S. would be just too extreme.
In the US, it might be. In countries where we just privatise, it might not be. But the other interesting thing is it changes the dynamics for renters.
Yeah, take that as a comment. Yes, thank you very much. Okay, in the interest of time, we have 1 minute left. Thank you very, very much. We have 1 minute left, so let's please join our hands together and thank the speakers for their wonderful presentations. And of course, thank you for your attendance and your wonderful questions. It's now time for a coffee break. Thank you.
Without that, the reason meaning intermingling. So it's really not yourself.
And beyond that, this idea that now we look might exacerbate your problem. But it may also be safer for a woman to live in a dense city in a tall high-rise than to have a house. So it could bring it back.
Women living, so you mentioned something that folks want to move into a home with their family. That's different than women moving into a residential herself. From that, I can imagine there was a demand, especially pushing public transit in high rise.
There's such pressure.
But that's why I think for the women thing, just desire to live in the high rise. Yeah, no, it's really
And is that, like the synthesizable better median need there's a
I'm sure it's
Yeah, I mean, it's not that complicated. But if you imagine that there's like kilowatts of PV versus
transform.
good.